Here is a motion picture film. Let's tidy up this tangle of film by putting it on a reel.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Film Swap. My name is David Seeley, and once again, I'm joined by my esteemed co-host, the ecstatic gaucho himself, Mr. Jonathan Pritchard Barrett. Jonathan, how are you today?
I'm well. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. And we've got a special guest with us, returning to the show, the guru of genre films. Is that fair to say, Richard, that you're kind of an expert in genre films?
It's fair enough to say, yeah.
Okay, good. That's lucky. But anyway, folks, this is all the way from Winnipeg, Manitoba in Canada. This is our good friend Richard Doyle, who's joined us tonight to do something a little bit different. This show, Film Swap, usually is the whole premise of Film Swap really was that people will come on and recommend films that they think are really good. But tonight we're kind of doing it a little bit different in that we're sort of as a companion piece to our previous episode, Bad Reputations, we're kind of doing a show of sort of films that really aren't held in very high regard at all, but they're both directed by very famous and well-respected filmmakers. In this case, they're both American filmmakers, and they're both, you know, sort of, is it fair to say they're kind of seminal filmmakers, aren't they? American filmmakers, Robert Altman and Sam Peckinpah, the great Sam Peckinpah, who's made many, many great films, as has Robert Altman, absolute classics. But they both made quite a few films, didn't they? They were quite prolific. And in this case, we're talking about films of theirs that are bad, not very good. And we've called the episode Great Directors, Bad Films, but with a question mark, because I think that's the whole point, is we're going to be kind of talking about that tonight. We're going to take a deeper dive into these films and just sort of have a discussion amongst ourselves about what we really think of these films and maybe trying to see if we can find some value within them. And I think we can. Is that fair to say? I think we definitely can.
Yep.
So I guess we've decided we're going to start with the least famous of the two films, or definitely the least seen of the two films. So we're going to start with Robert Altman's 1987, although even the 87 bit is a little bit hazy because the film was actually completed 3 or 4 years before, but it actually sat on the shelf because MGM basically, I guess, just didn't want to release it or didn't know what to do with it. So it didn't actually come out until 1987. And even then it was only shown in a handful of cinemas. And then maybe it went to home video and stuff as well. I guess it must have, because I saw a picture of a VHS cover. So it was kind of a straight to video, straight to cable kind of thing, and then just kind of disappeared without a trace. And it is not very highly regarded. It's called O.C. and Stiggs, and it was based on a National Lampoon feature. I guess, Richard, you might be able to tell us a bit more of that, because you mentioned today that you looked out some of the original articles that it was based on. So maybe to start out, if I could hand it over to you, just to maybe tell us a little bit about the original concept of O.C. and Stiggs as published in National Lampoon magazine.
Okay, sure. For several years leading up to 1982, there were like short O.C. and Stiggs stories published in National Lampoon that were largely about this very mean-spirited, destructive pair of suburban teenagers. But it culminated in 1982 in an entire issue devoted to O.C. and Stiggs that is largely the plot of this movie.
Oh, okay.
That one edition of it.
Yeah, one edition that's other than having. I was reading it this afternoon. Other than having the standard like letters and other features that were normally in it, every article in this is an extended version of their story of their one summer tormenting the neighbor that they despise, Randall Schwab, and other things, going to Mexico, etc., etc. Quite strikingly, the plot of this film without sharing a tone, because they're very mean spirited. It's really nasty comedy. I actually found it quite funny, but it's not for modern not for modern consumption. There's a lot of stuff in it that wouldn't fly that well these days.
Would you say do you mean like as in they're not sort of very politically correct?
That's what I mean. There's a lot of it's not drastic, but it's very impolite. I'd put it that way. Towards
Well, there are some elements in the film that we can discuss, I guess, a bit as well. There's a little bit of the old casual racism and some other sort of elements in the film that are a little bit sort of uncomfortable, I guess, for a modern audience as well. But so would you say, in your estimation, that this film then isn't particularly faithful to the articles in the magazine?
Yeah, it's interesting that apparently the screenplay was written by the guys who wrote the articles, and then Altman completely tossed it aside, which is sort of what it feels like. The details, like the events that happen, are all very similar, but the tone and sort of the smaller details are just completely different. I think the film feels improvised, to put it lightly, and I think that's largely what happened. I think Altman was famously sort of hostile towards screenwriters. He banned the guys who wrote this from the set, and does not seem to have followed any sort of screenplay that would have been derived from this article.
And by all accounts, they weren't happy with the finished product. Well, it doesn't seem like many people were happy with it, but certainly the writers of the original screenplay kind of disowned the film, didn't they? And they were very disappointed in what came out.
Yeah, one of them had his name removed.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. And as I mentioned, the film sat on the shelf for a couple of years because it's quite clear that I guess they had a very disastrous sort of preview screening, and the reception was so bad that MGM just sort of put it on the shelf and spent a little bit of time trying to figure out what they were going to do with it. And probably if it had been a film by any other filmmaker, they probably might have just shelved it full stop. But I guess because it was a Robert Altman film, they looked at various ways to try and salvage it. They looked at writing a narration to go over top of it that they thought might make it a bit more accessible. And they tried various other ways of looking at what they could do with it. But in the end, they just kind of snuck it out. They just sort of like, here it is. Okay, bye. Like that kind of thing. So, Jonathan, was this your first time seeing the film?
Not just first time. I'd never heard of this film before. When you said OC and Stiggs, what?
Well, so I think what might be interesting then is maybe for the listeners' benefit, and because you're someone who has just experienced the film for the very first time, how many times did you watch it before coming to record?
Just once.
Just the once. So I think you would be ideally placed to try and just briefly give the listeners a synopsis of what the film's about. And sorry for being mean to you in advance.
That's fine. No, that's a good way of doing it, actually. Yeah, it's about these two young guys. OC, who's Oliver Cromwell Ogilvy, which is a sort of weird name in itself, being Oliver Cromwell, and Mark Stiggs, and they call themselves OC and Stiggs, and they live in Phoenix, Arizona, and basically are they still at high school? Or are they sort of...
Yeah, they seem to be seniors at high school. Is that right, Richard?
They say they're graduating junior year at the beginning of the film.
Okay. So they're going into their so I guess from a UK perspective, that means they'd be going into sort of sixth form next year or
Okay, so
something
they're
like
like
that.
16.
Yeah,
Well,
something like
they seem a bit older than that, but they're sort of 18, 19, something like that, it seems like. Anyway, but obviously they're meant to be a bit younger. And they sort of get into all these sort of scrapes. It's a very episodic film.
that.
Uh, I mean, quite what happens, it's very difficult to say. In my notes, I wrote down confusing narrative.
Yes.
And but basically, one of the main things is that they got this neighbor called Mr. Schwab, who I think he runs an insurance company,
Yeah.
and they basically hate his guts. They're always sort of breaking into his house. They climb over the wall, a sort of not particularly high wall, to get in there and sort of play tricks on him. And they're sort of weird tricks. Basically, they're running up an incredibly high phone bill by sort of making phone calls to Chad or somewhere in Africa, because they know that it's very high sort of phone, expensive to call there, and then they end up with this sort of like car which goes up and down like a sort of hot rod type thing, but like literally and metaphorically on stilts, a hot rod on stilts, which they drive around town in. And at one stage, they decide to go to Mexico, and rather than drive there like everybody else, they get in rubber rings and sort of float down a river
Yes.
and then wash up on the Mexican side of the river. And that's their trick there. And I mean, the whole thing is just utterly bizarre. And I was thinking, at one stage, this is a sort of stoner movie, basically.
Yeah. Kind of.
Because then it doesn't really have to make sense, and it's a sort of series of weird events. And it's quite a film.
Richard, is there anything in terms of the plot that Jonathan, and that was, to be honest, he did great in explaining it, because I've watched the film a few times now since the Radiance Blu-ray came out, or I should say I've tried to watch it, because I tried to watch it twice before, and I ended up turning it off halfway through because mainly I was just maybe too tired to cope with it or whatever, and I just was like, I just went through this sort of, I'm wasting my life here, I'm going to turn this off now. And then, but obviously because we decided to talk about it on the podcast, I made a concerted effort this morning. I sat down with it, and I said, I am going to engage with this even if it kills me, and I'm going to watch this film from the very beginning to the very end, and I'm going to try and get something out of this so I can be able to have a reasonably intelligent conversation about it. And I have to say, having seen it for the third time-ish, but the first time that I got to the end of it, I think it is one of those kind of films that if you see it more than once, you begin to get more out of it, because some things that you maybe missed the first time, you pick up on those little narrative threads and those little things, and you're able to connect the dots a bit better. So I will say that having watched it for the third time, I kind of was able to appreciate it a bit more than I was previous. So that's why I thought it'd be interesting to hear Jonathan's initial take on it, because the narrative structure of it, it's very much like Robert Altman's other films in that it's a big ensemble piece with lots of things going on all the time. But unlike things like MASH or Nashville or any of those, or even The Player or any of those kind of films, this film really, I struggled the first time to really be able to engage with it and figure out what was going on or care about the characters or engage with the characters on any level. It did just seem like this constant barrage of stuff happening, and that was my take. So sorry, Richard, over to you.
Yeah, this is the second time I've watched it, and I'll say at least It's not my least favorite Robert Altman film. There's at least 3 films I can think of that I think are worse than this one. And it's funny you mentioned MASH because this kind of reminds me of MASH.
Yeah, it is
In this,
kind of,
in
it
this
is MASH in a way. It's kind of MASH only set in
yeah,
1980s Phoenix with a bunch of high school kids rather than being in Korea during the
yeah,
war, you know?
and that's kind of its problem. I think is that when you think about MASH, the main characters are truly really mean spirited guys, but I think the setting makes that more palatable to a lot of people, right? That these are doctors in wartime, sort of, dealing with military authority, adds some stakes that I think more people respond to. And here, I'll say I liked the National Lampoon stories, although thought they were a bit much. And I like this one partly because I think it captures a certain kind of hostility you get from teenagers who are bored and dissatisfied, and that can be really over the top. And I think, like MASH, it's really episodic, like extremely so. And I think the problem is it's too episodic and it continuously falls apart.
Yeah, yeah,
Apparently, this was shot like in the vicinity of a hotel with an open bar,
yes,
and dailies were watched with the consumption of both marijuana and cocaine. And it feels like that. It feels like the attention of the people making this movie continually kind of lapses. Plot lines just sort of disappear, and
yeah.
and some just come out of nowhere. I think it's weird to say, but the National Lampoon article establishes some characters better than this does.
Yeah,
Like they've got those 2 girlfriends that they call by the epithet I won't repeat
yeah.
on the podcast. And the article at least explains who they are, and I don't think the movie ever does.
No, no, they are quite literally just that,
Yeah,
and they get brought on,
yeah,
and they just kind of wander on through the narrative, as it were. But you're right, there's never, and I kind of feel that way kind of about all the characters, and to a certain extent, because you never are able to hang your hat on any real sort of empathy for anyone, because everyone's kind of slightly sort of absurd or unpleasant, or including OC and Stiggs themselves. They're
yeah,
not particularly likable characters, you know. And it's kind of like a kind of an anti Ferris Bueller's Day Off in a sense, isn't it? Because at least Ferris Bueller is likable. He's like someone who you can kind of relate to in a way, and you kind of think, he's charming enough that even when he's behaving badly, you can kind of empathize with him. Whereas these 2 guys are just really kind of unpleasant and kind of mean spirited, and they're always doing things. And they may have a valid sort of reason why they dislike Mr. Schwab and his insurance company, because there is a plot point around why they hate him. But at the same time, they do really horrible things to the young son, and they're always doing these really, ridiculous pranks and things, like stealing their food or swapping their food out or putting stuff in their, or setting off a machine gun at the girl's wedding and all this stuff. And it's kind of like, it's not funny. And it's quite, some of it's quite nasty, and also kind of quite pointless, really, as well. Like, it's kind of like this sort of like being nasty for nasty's sake, rather than, having a real point to what they're trying to accomplish, or the point that they're trying to make. So for
yeah,
me, that's what the difference between MASH. Because if you mention MASH, you can see that film came out during the Vietnam War. It was set in a war zone. You can understand that these are 2 intelligent guys who are caught in this situation where they're having to cope with the constant trauma and the fear and the anxieties and the ridiculousness of the situation. And you can kind of empathize with that and go along with the satire, Whereas with OC and Stiggs, it's not quite that clear cut because everybody is just, they're all sort of rich, spoiled people who are just behaving badly kind of for the sake of it, really, because like you say, they're kind of bored or unhappy and they don't know why. So, you know.
I think the movie goes away towards trying to remedy that with like OC's grandfather, the Robert Walston is the ex-cop, like giving some stakes, like that he has to find some means of taking care of his grandfather so he doesn't have to move to Arkansas
Yeah.
and put his grandfather in a home. But it's only like a tiny little portion of the film, and that's sort of my problem with the film in general. I'm sort of at times suddenly entertained by it and will sit for about 10 minutes and go, this isn't so bad. And then it drifts off into something where I'm going, well, this is so bad.
Yeah. And it kind of, so we did that very first, like, because to me, it made a really bad impression right up front because when the MGM lion comes on at the beginning, they do this little sort of like, oh, see, Ed Stiggs instead of the roar. And you just kind of think, oh, God, that's the kind of level of satire that I'm going to get with this. That immediately sort of turns me off and makes me go, oh, God, is that the best you can do? Kind of thing. And the level of the humor is kind of like that all the way through it, isn't it, really?
Well, it's funny because, yeah, exactly. Early on, they've got these, when jokes happen, they go, that's what you get in sort of children's programs, basically. And the sort of frames, sort of wobbles and stuff like that. And you think, really, this is just amazing. But then there's other bits where, like, there's this sort of wedding and there's the birds sort of crapping everywhere.
Yeah.
Basically, which is sort of weird, but actually quite effective. It's sort of this sort of unpleasant, but not. It's not sort of. I mean, I guess it's sort of pretty coarse humor as well, but it's a slightly more inventive, at least, than the sort of type.
Yeah.
And there's other things like that where you think, oh, this is actually quite creative filmmaking here. But it also you have this, the sort of weirdness as well.
Yeah. I was just sorry, I'm just trying to think of the name of the because you brought up that scene. So I'm trying to think of the lady who's I'm trying to find her name really quickly. Cynthia Nixon.
Oh yeah.
Someone who more recently I've earned a lot of respect for her because she's one of the few sort of celebrities along with Susan Sarandon that showed a little bit of sort of moral, courage and lately to speak out about things. So I give her dues. But in this film, she was obviously quite young. But in that wedding scene, there's the bit when Stiggs is it, or no, it's OC who falls for her, and they do a little sort of Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers pastiche when they meet. And you would think that there's lots of little film references and things like that throughout it, but that didn't really come off for me because the way it was sort of brought in, it kind of seemed almost out of place with the sort of general level that the film was on to then suddenly go into this elaborate sort of homage to old time cinema. I'm not really sure where that fit into this satire of consumerist 1980s America kind of thing. Maybe I'm missing the point. Did any of you guys sort of get the joke there? Or?
No. I didn't mind it, but I'm not sure that I understand it as much more of a joke than it's a weird thing that happens.
Yeah.
And a lot of the humor in the movie seems to be that's a weird thing that just happened.
Yeah, and quite random, but sort of just out of the blue. And it's always like a lot. Robert Altman does this in a lot of his films, but apparently they had everybody mic'd up all the time. So even when they had these big sort of set pieces with loads of people on screen, you can hear everyone and what they're saying. And I guess the idea, and sometimes this works really well in some of his films where someone off in the background might make a comment or something that's interesting and adds to the moment. So you get these little bits of dialogue from different people that you wouldn't necessarily be focused on right in front, center screen. And you get these little interesting comments and things. But here, a lot of it, again, it just seems like it's just constantly these random things happening. And you have what's the lady's name? Jane Curtin. I always kind of forget her name or get her muddled up with somebody else. But she, the big thing for her character is that she's always fittered away alcohol, and she's hidden them in all these very increasingly surreal and ridiculous ways that she's hidden alcohol so that she can take a drink. And that's her whole character. There's no sort of real substance to her character at all. Her character is just about substance abuse rather than having anything about like, well, why is she like that, or what is it that, it's just that aimlessness of it all that I think I found really off-putting the first time I watched it. I just was literally like, what is this about? Where is this going? And I could see the satire because it's perfectly valid to satirize this lifestyle, these people, and the kind of the way that they're choosing to spend their time in their lives. But none of it ever comes off for me at all. None of it ever rings true, and none of it ever sort of hits home or makes any real sort of points. It's all just this meandering kind of, let's throw a bunch of stuff out there and see what sticks kind of vibe to it.
Yeah, the drinking, that's another bit of where the sort of politically, I mean, maybe in sort of 30 years ago we would sort of laugh at this. Now we think, well, this is somebody who's got a sort of serious problem, and that's not actually very funny at all.
Yeah.
Even though maybe half the crew are probably in the same boat, it sounds like. Yeah. It's very, very strange. Not only do they get in weird outfits, but the sets are very odd as well. The costumes are very odd too. Sort of weird clothes, sort of like the sort of psychedelic golfer type thing, and it's very odd. But there are these. Yeah, I really like the sort of dancing bit. It is I just felt it was like a just a sort of rather beautiful interlude in this sort of weird film in a way. There was another one as well where they go in a helicopter ride, and there's all these sort of fireworks going on in the background. I mean, it was just quite, nice sort of beautiful scene. It's just a sort of weird grab bag of things, these sort of weird ideas that you seem to come up with.
Yeah, and that end bit, that big set piece, that's kind of supposed to, presumably, the narrative was all building up to that. This was supposed to be the big, the big sort of thing that they were going to do to the Schwabs to get their, I know, is it revenge, I guess? Is that what they're trying to do? Or I guess, I don't know, just torment them. But there's no build, like there's no build to a sort of crescendo in the film, is there? It all is just sort of like that the whole way along. There's no kind of arc to it. Would you say that's fair?
Yep. I mean, in my notes, halfway through, I wrote a series of increasingly improbable scenarios, which sort of seems basically just what you were saying.
Yeah.
I'll tell you one of the moments I really did kind of like, even though I admit I don't know really why it's in it. One of the things they've added for the movie that is not in the stories is it Stiggs' love of King Sunny Ade?
Yes.
Yeah.
And when King Sunny Ade take the place of the community theater play, and not just play, but every character in the movie inexplicably dances to them. I thought there was something kind of joyous about that, and I wish that had gone on a bit longer.
Yeah.
It looks totally improvised, like some of the actors just figuring out how they're going to dance to this African music. It was joyous in a way that much of the movie is not.
Yeah, that was another bit I actually really liked as well. I did write that down, give it a big tick, saying that that's a really nice sort of moment, that sort of live, concert. And I have to say, I'd never heard of King Sunny Ade before, but really great stuff.
Yeah, it is. I agree. It's a nice moment, a nice little sort of party moment in there. And yeah, I agree with you. And I think, as I said, watching it this third time, I was able, because I really made a concerted effort, I think, to try and get on its wavelength. And I think so I was able to follow it along a bit more, and I didn't feel kind of frustrated with it like I did the previous times that I tried to watch it, because I kind of, it was a sheer force of will at first, but I think once I got on that wavelength, I was able to just sort of appreciate it. And I did enjoy all the little cameos. I thought the Martin Mull's bit was all right, and I quite liked seeing Melvin Van Peebles. I mean, I always like it when Melvin Van Peebles pops up and stuff. And, but unfortunately he was kind of a little bit underused, wasn't he? They just sort of had him there a couple times and then they kill him off. And I didn't really like the Dennis Hopper stuff, Apocalypse Now.
Yeah.
So, which seemed quite soon, because this wouldn't have been that long after Apocalypse Now came out. And this is before am I right that this is kind of before Dennis Hopper kind of had his sort of resurgence, and, he sort of had his sort of comeback a few years later, didn't he? But this was when he was still a little bit, his career was a little bit on the skids at the time, wasn't he? Because he was seen as an unreliable kind of person.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It was shot before he had his resurgence, but it would have been released after it made his comeback.
Yeah, that's true.
86 or so.
Yeah. Actually, yeah, that's a good point, actually, because most people wouldn't have seen it till afterwards. But it just seems like a curious thing that only, because when did Apocalypse Now come out? It was 79, wasn't it?
Yeah.
79. So this film was shot in 83. So it was only a few years later, and they were already kind of thinking, oh, let's get Dennis Hopper and do a little parody of Apocalypse Now in the middle of this movie kind of thing. And it just seems like a curious kind of choice of trying to be funny, really. I don't know. I mean, I didn't really enjoy any of that bit when they were sort of, getting the guns out and talking about all that stuff. But you could kind of see, like I say, like I'm kind of totally behind the film in spirit in terms of the things that they're satirizing and the things that the kind of the little sort of point, but I don't think it tackles any of those things very successfully or with any real sort of vigor or purpose. And I think that's why it's a little bit disappointing, I think.
Yeah. I think that's the Dennis Hopper bit, because he's quite an interesting actor, and he brings real presence to the screen. But there, it was just not very exciting at all.
Is there any other kind of things that you guys wanted to say about it, or
nothing particular? No.
I think the totality of my defense would be not his worst film.
Well, okay. Well, then let's, if you don't mind, then would you put that on the record then to say, which films of his do you think are worse than this?
Yeah, Dr. T and the Women.
Okay, I don't think I've seen that one actually.
Ready to Wear.
Okay, yeah.
And I think there's one more that's escaping me right now, but I would definitely say Dr. T and the Women and Ready to Wear. Oh, I don't really like Kansas City with Jennifer Jason Leigh and Harry Belafonte.
Oh, yeah. See, it's been so many years, I can't really remember that. Like, I remember it, but I don't, if you know what I mean.
He's very prolific.
Yeah, he made a lot of films. He made a lot of films, and it is true, like his consistency. I mean, we're going to talk about Sam Peckinpah in a few minutes, and I think it's fair to say Sam Peckinpah, who was also relatively prolific, he made quite a few films,
Yeah.
uh, and he was generally a little bit more consistent, wasn't he? Is that fair to say? I think
Yeah,
most of his films are pretty good, even the ones that maybe aren't great are still interesting enough that you can say this is worth watching. Um, but yeah, Robert Altman. I think it's fair to say. I mean, there are a few other films of his that maybe don't quite come off, but I think this one in particular really struck me because it's very rare, even worst case scenarios. I mean, I remember walking out on Stargate the first time I saw it in the cinema years ago, and I remember walking out on it because I hated it that much. And this film was another very rare case where I literally just couldn't hack it. I was like not enjoying it so much that I switched it off. But today I did. I was strong and I saw it through. And I think there are moments in it, like Richard, you've said that there are certain moments where you maybe it brings a smile to your face and you kind of think, oh, that bit was kind of cool, or that bit was a bit funny, or whatever. It has little sort of pockets of entertainment value in it, but overall, it just doesn't work, does it? It just it's just a mess of a thing.
Yeah, but when I was watching it, I was feeling like maybe I'm looking at it too critically,
Mm,
and the best way to appreciate it is to sort of take it as it is, if
yeah.
you know what I mean. And it's I just go along for the ride, and a weird ride it is.
Mm,
Uh, then it was less, it wasn't quite bad. It was just a sort of unusual film, if
yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Well, that's why I thought it would be interesting to talk about, and I guess I wanted to um, hear what other people's point of view. I mean, what it would have been ideal if, like, for instance, Richard had come on and said, "I love this film. I think it's brilliant." That would have been a really interesting conversation because I'd like to hear somebody say that to me, like explain to me that why they think this film's really brilliant, and I would be interested in hearing that. We didn't quite get that, but that's okay too because I think it's just I just wanted to get people's views on it because it is an interesting oddity and something that I thought would be worth exploring because he's a major director,
Mm.
but he didn't always hit home runs, did he? And
Yeah.
this is a film in particular because it just very recently came out on Blu-ray, which if I can remember where I put it, this is sorry, I'll try and get it in focus with my dodgy camera here, but the this is from Radiance Films here in the UK, and they're a label that they're relatively new, and they're doing a lot of really interesting stuff at the minute. So I highly recommend folks check them out. But this is one of the films that they put out recently, which is how I came to see it because I thought, oh, Robert Altman, I'd like to see that. That sounds interesting. And then I didn't like it, but at least it's an interesting specimen, and I think it's worth seeking out if you can. Oddly enough, we checked, and it's not available on streaming or anything. It is literally that Blu-ray, as far as I can tell, is the only way that you can see the film at the minute. And
Mm.
oddly enough, Radiant still has lots of copies. They seem to sell out of their discs relatively quickly, except for that one. Funny that. So you can still get it, folks, if you go out there and try and find it. So on that note, guys, was there any last thoughts you had on OC and Stiggs? Yep,
Strange film.
strange film. Okay, no, okay, but would you recommend it to somebody? Would you say check this out?
Well, I wouldn't. I would. I would if maybe if it was sort of on your streaming service, but maybe I wouldn't pay extra. There's some services you do have to now. Yeah, I wouldn't pay extra, but if it was sort of free, maybe. Yeah.
Okay. If it's free, it's worth seeing.
Or part of your monthly package, which seems
A
pretty.
glowing endorsement if ever there was one.
You're paying for it, but not as much.
Okay. All right. Well, okay. Well, great. Guys, thank you. That was cool. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to take a little break for a few minutes so we can compose ourselves. And then we're going to get in our truck. We're going to get on our CBs and we're going to join Kris Kristofferson on the Convoy. So, folks, if you'll just bear with us for a couple of seconds while we have a very brief message, which I'm sure you'll find fascinating. And then we'll be back for the second in our double bill of great directors, bad films. So we'll see you in just a moment.
Thanks for listening to the Film Swap podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider giving the show a rating or leaving a review. This helps other listeners find the show. You can follow the Film Swap on social media. We're on Twitter and TikTok at Film Swap UK, on Instagram at Film Swap Media, and on YouTube at Film Swap_podcast, and at Facebook at Film Swap the podcast.
And we're back. Welcome back, listeners. Welcome back, Jonathan, and our special guest today, Richard Doyle, all the way from Winnipeg, Manitoba. How is it there? Is it starting to get hot there now, Richard?
Snow's melting.
Yeah?
It's sort of typical spring here, very cold and then very warm and then very cold. So you never know what you're supposed to wear outside.
Yeah, but you guys will get it in the summer. It gets like sort of roasting hot there, doesn't it? And you get all the mosquitoes and everything, don't you?
Yeah. We go from 30 above to 30 below in Winnipeg.
Wow.
Right. Well, my oldest son lives in Winnipeg, but I haven't actually been out there for a while. But it's a nice place. It's a good city. So. On that note, if I was going to go to Winnipeg, I might hop in my big semi and get on the CB radio and let Rubber Ducky know I'm on my way. And I join the Convoy. And that's what we're going to talk about next in our double bill of great directors, bad films, ? Because we're going to talk about the 1978 action comedy starring the late, great Kris Kristofferson, directed by none other than Sam Peckinpah. And this was this his last film, or it was close to his last film? He made a couple more?
At least one more. I think only one more, The Osterman Weekend.
Yes, The Osterman Weekend. God, I haven't seen that. Is Rutger Hauer in that one, isn't he?
Yeah.
Dennis Hopper. Yeah, well, I haven't seen that for a long time. I'd be interested in seeing that again. I don't remember much about it, except, I remember it exists, but that's about it. But so Convoy came out in 1978. Is it fair to say that, too, is it from a commercial marketing point of view, that this film was, because this was kind of hot on the heels of sort of Smokey and the Bandit, wasn't it? And in a sense, I think this film is kind of meant as a kind of a Smokey and the Bandit kind of thing. But in this case, it's not just a guy in a sports car driving across country getting chased. It's a whole convoy of trucks. And it was based on a pop song, wasn't it? Like a single popular sort of country and western big hit record at the time. Like I'm old enough to remember. Richard, you're kind of roughly in my sort of age range as well, I think. So is it fair to say you remember when Convoy was a big hit on the radio?
C.W. McCall.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this film came out around that time, and it was kind of, I guess, kind of playing a bit on that CB radio kind of trucker movie kind of craze. There was a few other things that came out around that time. There was that thing with Jan Michael Vincent, White Line Fever. Is that what it was called? I
Yeah.
remember seeing that at the drive-in, and there was a few other kind of truck movies. And in Japan, there was a whole series of trucker. There was a whole series of truck movies, like action adventure movies of
Hey.
a trucker, which um, I'm not sure how widely seen they are in North America, or in Europe, but they're kind of interesting films as well. So there was a bit of a craze about the trucker thing around this time, and this film kind of a I don't know. Maybe I should hand it over to somebody else to try and explain what the film is about, because I'm not sure. So, Richard, if you don't mind, I'll hand it over to you to tell listeners, if they've never seen it, a little bit about Convoy.
It surprisingly mirrors the lyrics of the song a little bit, right? And then it's got the characters. Um, so we've got Kris Kristofferson as Rubber Duck. Burt Young is a cowboy, which is a very strange bit of casting.
Yes.
Calls himself Love Machine, but because he's hauling pigs, they're calling him Pigpen, who he is in the song. And there's Franklin Ajay as a character whose name I'm forgetting, but they're all driving trucks along, and they're pulled over by a sheriff played by Ernest Borgnine, who blackmails them, like threatening to chuck them in jail for a little bit for sort of made up violations if they don't pay him money.
Mm. He's a corrupt policeman,
Yeah.
isn't he, on the highway? Yeah.
So this leads to conflict with Ernest Borgnine, a big fight in a truck stop, and they take off for the New Mexico border because they're in Arizona when it starts.
Mm.
And this slowly, by the time they get Arizona, and for reasons I'm not too clear on, the Arizona State Police are pursuing them now.
Yeah. Yeah. So the original idea was to get across the state line so that Ernest Borgnine couldn't touch them anymore.
Yeah.
But the situation escalates.
It does.
Well, yeah, you could say that. I'd say, prefacing one of my little problems with the film, I think the plot's a little bit sketchy, to say the least.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when they get into Arizona, they start attracting other trucks that have been listening to this happen over the CB radio, and pretty soon they have a convoy, a big convoy of trucks that, one, they can't be stopped because there's sort of solidarity in numbers, and two, Kristofferson reveals that he's driving a truck full of explosive chemicals, so trying to physically stop him could result in a huge explosion.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's basically them trying to negotiate a way out of this, like being pursued by the police situation. There's more plot machinations as you get into the second half, but that is basically the plot of the film. They drive around in trucks and the police chase them.
Yeah. And it's never really clear, is it, exactly what the, like, because it's kind of becomes, it becomes a protest movement, but I'm not really clear exactly what the point is. And I guess there's even a plot point around that about the fact that all these truckers fall into this convoy and kind of join behind Kris Kristofferson in solidarity. But then when they look to him as the leader to lead them, he's kind of like, well, I don't know. What do you do? I don't know what to do. So that kind of becomes sort of an element of the plot, doesn't it?
One of the things it doesn't do very well is it gestures at things that were kind of topical at the time. Like one of the complaints is that the U.S. highway speed limit had just been changed to 55 miles an hour.
Mm.
And truckers were upset about that. But the film just sort of gestures at it without really saying that that's the issue, per se. You know?
Yeah.
It's sort of a way in which the film just assumes that truckers and cops are enemies without really doing anything to establish the fact that truckers and police have an enmity, you know.
Yeah.
He's just going to take it for granted.
And it's odd too because it's not even like it's like a call for, because a lot of the Teamsters union was quite powerful at this time, and most truckers were organized under the Teamster banner. But Kris Kristofferson, they make a point of him declaring at the beginning, "Well, I'm not in the union. I'm independent, and I'm not in the union." So again, that becomes another sort of, so why are all the other truckers kind of falling in behind this guy? Because he's not even in the union, and he's not even really in solidarity with them. So why is it? It's just because he's another trucker and he's in trouble, I guess. So it just kind of slightly kind of doesn't ring true in a sense, does it?
Yeah.
But
I also realized I left out Ally MacGraw, and
yeah,
she hitches a ride with him, sort of, and I guess they fall in love because the film says so. But
yeah.
I think one of the biggest flaws with the film is that she's almost a stunning non-presence in the film, and is the co-lead.
Yeah, and you're never really sure where her allegiance lies or anything as well, because she's introduced as very much this kind of lone character who's out on the highway just sort of taking care of herself. And she kind of hitches a ride just out of kind of convenience with him. And then, and it makes clear that she didn't really want to get involved in any of these sort of, problems and troubles that end up developing.
Yeah.
Yet she just kind of sticks around and is a presence in the film. And I guess, yeah, it's just kind of as a love interest. And, she was, I guess, a fairly sort of popular actress at the time and been in a lot of big hit films. So I guess it was just the star presence and having a love interest for Kris Kristofferson. And that's interesting too in the casting, because at this time it's fair to say that, because this is just pre Heaven's Gate, and so Kris Kristofferson was really at the top of his game as far as being a film star at this time. He was kind of like a major box office draw, wasn't he, at this point? And he'd been in a string of hit films. And this film, I think, was successful as a commercial hit, wasn't it?
It's Sam Peckinpah's most commercially successful film.
Yeah, which is extraordinary.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there is some entertainment value. I'm sorry, Jonathan, you haven't had a chance to sort of say anything yet about what you think of the film.
Well, I think this is a lot better than the first one. A lot more enjoyable. You can see why it was a commercial hit because, well, it sort of makes sense to an extent. It might have sort of small flaws in the plot, but then loads of enjoyable films do. And what the things I really liked about it, well, I like the fact that you got these, the actors, Kris Kristofferson and Ernest Borgnine and old Burt Young, who I wasn't that familiar with before. I mean, what I also really liked, not just the sort of the acting, or the stars rather, but I like the fact that this is a sort of contemporary Western. So of course Sam Peckinpah is famous for his westerns, and that fight early on, where that is basically the reason that they go into the convoy and go on the run, because they sort of basically have a fight with some policemen in a sort of bar or a sort of roadside diner. Actually, that was just a sort of good sort of Western style fight, and very inventive. And then there's another bit where they're sort of having a meeting in a tent with a politician, and the way it sort of cuts between the different characters, it made me think of a sort of a gunfight with each of them standing at either end of the sort of the street or wherever they meet in gunfights, basically. And I just like the fact, and of course, Kris Kristofferson's a country singer, and he's like, his next film after this was playing a cowboy in Heaven's Gate, and so he was like, he's a cowboy basically, and here he was playing a sort of a cowboy but driving a truck. And I guess these were modern cowboys, which I found quite a sort of interesting idea. And I also really like the stunts. I mean, you've got some amazing sort of car, lorries, or truck stunts.
Yeah, apparently some of them were unintentional as well. Like some of them were genuine accidents that they left them in the film.
Yeah, well, there's one of them, where Ernest Borgnine goes off the side of this sort of slope and sort of
Yeah.
rolls down, and then he gets out, or the camera sort of sees him, getting out of the car, and you realise, of course, they're not wearing blinking seatbelts back then.
Yeah.
And really, I guess in real life, you would most likely have died. But anyway, that's a funny, funny side to it all. That, of course, back then they didn't wear seatbelts. But yeah, I like the sort of political side of it in the sense that what are these people sort of? It's a little bit like Network, where they are mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore.
Mm.
It's sort of generalized sort of frustration with, life. And when they go around into this sort of journalists interviewing, actually, I think they're sort of somewhat journalists, representatives of the governor or senator or something, and they're interviewing all these people. Each one's got a different sort of gripe, basically. And I guess that's often the way it is with sort of political movements. Everybody has a different gripe, but they just about got enough in common to sort of come together to sort of do something. And so I quite like that sort of side of it as well, and the way that with this sort of slippery fish of a governor who's trying to sort of basically co-opt them, which I thought was quite nice, because he's sort of almost trustworthy, but obviously not at the same time.
Yeah, he has his own agenda, but at the same time, he could genuinely kind of help them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which I quite like that sort of side to it. And I really liked it. I mean, when I was talking to a friend yesterday about it, I said I'd watched Convoy. And he said, "Oh, that was one of my dad's favourite films."
Brilliant.
Quite fun. And yeah, I mean, I've heard the name Convoy, and I remember, I think they played a song on the radio every so often. It's a sort of famous song, but I'd never seen it, and I was seen Smokey and the Bandit, but not this one. And yeah, I did enjoy it. I guess it's it's not as sort of serious as his other films, sort of proper westerns, but that's fine. It is a bit less. It doesn't take itself quite as seriously, and that's fine by me.
Well, yeah. Well, Richard, would you so what is because I remember when I first approached you about joining us for the conversation, you said that you like Convoy. So
I do.
Yeah.
There's only probably like a single. The only Peckinpah film I don't really like is actually The Osterman Weekend.
Okay.
But I agree that there's a lot of stuff in this film that is really quite enjoyable, and I think it's just sort of sitting and watching a movie. It's good. I think the problem with it is so he was on a pretty bad streak at this point. Not all bad
Sam
films.
Peckinpah, you mean?
Yeah, Sam Peckinpah.
Yeah.
Not all bad films, right? But
Yeah.
a lot of films that people highly regard now, like Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid and Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, did really poorly and weren't really well received. And The Killer Elite wasn't well received, and Cross of Iron wasn't well received. So he ends up agreeing to make this film. And apparently the cut that he turned in as just a rough initial cut was 3.5 hours long. And he didn't really indicate any willingness to significantly trim it down. So they fired him and gave the editor control over cutting this back down to the 1.5 hour it is now. And I think that kind of shows on the film, in that it's not just that it's a bit sketchy, like plot-wise, but I think you see a lot of things in it that are sort of Peckinpah touches, like the fight and slow motion truck accidents and things. that don't feel as skillfully dropped into the film as he would have if he had supervised the edit.
Mm.
They're they're nice and recognizably him, but the film feels less calibrated than he would have normally done.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
by all accounts, because on the Blu-ray that I have, there's a really excellent documentary about the making of the film, and they talk to all the stars and the behind-the-scenes people, and apparently some of the things that I mentioned about the sort of the lack of depth of the purpose of the truckers, apparently there was more to that in Peckinpah's version or in his original conception of the film, that there was more of an arc and more of a solid sort of story about this movement and what they were trying to accomplish and what they achieve in his version of the film. But when they took the film away from him, all that was lost. So that's why where the film, I guess, has been in the edit, it was just by virtue of the circumstances was kind of dumbed down quite a bit from what Sam Peckinpah's original conception was. So I guess that's something you have to kind of bring that context to it when you're watching it, is to understand that this isn't really what Sam Peckinpah wanted people to see. It wasn't what was meant. It wasn't what he meant for people to see. So
Interesting.
yeah.
So I guess, does that mean that his sort of original vision may one day be recovered, or is it all lost?
Well, I mean, who knows? I don't think there's any will to do that, really. I've never heard anyone say, oh, let's restore Convoy to the original Sam Peckinpah version. Because I think the problem is because the film did well, it was successful. And
Right.
it is, I guess, maybe not so much nowadays, but it's a popular film. It's like it's a well liked film that did very well. So there's probably not a lot of will to go back and say, oh, let's try and restore this to the Sam Peckinpah cut or whatever.
Yeah.
So whether, even if that's possible, whether they actually retained any of the elements and would have enough sort of information to be able to go back and do that without Sam Peckinpah.
There probably also isn't any idea what that would be,
Yeah.
because this isn't like Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid where he finished a cut of the film
Mm.
and then had to cut stuff from it. Like the 3.5 hour cut isn't his cut, really. It's like the rough cut of the film, and they fired him before he made a version of the film that he wanted, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think it's tough to say what you would do with it. You wouldn't. I don't think anyone's going to say let's release a 3.5 hour version of Convoy, but it'd be
Yeah.
hard to figure out what to do with it.
It's very similar to that situation, a few years ago when Netflix put out that Other Side of the Wind, the Orson Welles thing. And it's the same kind of thing because you can watch it and it's interesting, but deep down that that isn't what it would have looked like if Orson Welles had actually finished it, because he's dead and he never finished it. So you can't say this is his film, this is what you would have got. And I guess it would be the same, you're right, with Convoy, because there'd be no way to go back now and be able to say definitively, this is what Sam Peckinpah meant for you to see. So so it almost would be a pointless exercise to a certain degree.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true. That's true.
But
It's still enjoyable.
it is indeed. I mean, I'll agree. Like, I mean, I've included in this as a bad film in the sense of, because it is. Let's face it. It's a bit stupid, isn't it? Really, to be fair, it's just a kind of a big dumb entertainment, isn't it? And I guess with someone like Sam Peckinpah, because you mentioned films like Bring Me the Head of Alfred Garcia and lots of other films, he was an intelligent filmmaker, and his films he made very entertaining, accessible films, but they had a lot of heart and soul to them and a lot of intelligence, and there was kind of a point to them. They were layered and interesting films. And this film doesn't have that same kind of, that kind of depth to it that you would expect from Sam Peckinpah. So that, I think, is in the sense, and because if you understand the history of the production, you just know that this isn't kind of what he this isn't what he wanted, and this is how it didn't turn out the way he wanted. And apparently he was in a bad way at the time. He was having some health issues, and he was having some substance abuse problems. And like Richard mentioned, he'd had a string of films that maybe were not well received. So he kind of was a bit, I guess, in a state where he needed a hit. He needed, he kind of was doing this as a working filmmaker. He just wanted to make a film and he wanted a job, basically. So he took it, even though maybe deep down it wasn't something he, it was 100% invested in, at least not initially. But he did conceive of an idea, and he had a plan, and it didn't come off. So if you understand that, you can then look at the film in two different ways. You can look at it as a big, entertaining, kind of big popcorn movie, big dumb popcorn movie, or you can look at it as a Sam Peckinpah kind of a failure in a creative failure from Sam Peckinpah's point of view. So that's, I guess, the two ways you can approach it.
Yeah, I think as a sort of popcorn movie, it pretty much works. But it seems like, we can only say that as it was taken off his hands, it was obviously a failure because he didn't do it.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, interestingly, when the credits come up, it says second unit director James Coburn. I thought,
Yes, that is an interesting point. That James Coburn was involved in this film behind the scenes. Oddly enough, in that little documentary that comes on the disc, they have a whole section about that. The fact that James Coburn wanted to get into directing himself, so he came to Sam Peckinpah and just said, "Can I do some of the second unit stuff or whatever?" So a lot of the second unit sort of material was directed by James Coburn. So isn't that amazing?
Right.
Very interesting. He's not in the film at all, though, is he? Like, not even in a little cameo or anything.
You can see Sam, though. He's when the governor's aide is driving alongside and interviewing the truckers.
He's one of the cameramen.
Yeah, Peckinpah is operating the camera.
Oh, is he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can barely see him, though.
Yeah. And it's only for a split second. Yeah, but it's interesting. Isn't there a couple of other little cameos? For some reason, it escapes me now, but I was thinking that there was a couple other people who kind of pop up in the background, but they're all people like technical people from his crew. That there's one scene where there's an ice cream truck, and they one of the police cars or something smashes into it, and it's actually like I don't want to commit myself, but it's like one of the sort of cameramen or one of the one of the technical crew who basically stood in as the character of the ice cream truck driver, who kind of goes, "Oh, Mamma Mia, my truck," kind of when it gets smashed. So there's all interesting stuff like that. And what do you make Ally MacGraw's?
I think she's partly in this because she was in The Getaway, which would have been his most successful film commercially before this.
Yeah.
And I've always thought she's a bit of a thin actress, but she comes off quite well in The Getaway. And here, I'm not even sure if I blame her. There's barely a character there.
Yeah, well, in that documentary, she says, too, that she felt a bit lost on the set, because Sam Peckinpah was just like hiding in his trailer half the time, and she didn't really get any direction. And, the whole thing sounds like it was quite chaotic. And apparently they tried to fire Sam Peckinpah during the filming. At a certain point, they went to him and basically tried to sack him off, but apparently Kris Kristofferson said that he would walk if they fired him. So they brought him back. But at certain points, apparently he was just hiding in his trailer all day, and he didn't come out till like 4 o'clock in the afternoon and stuff like that. So Ally MacGraw didn't really have a good experience from the sound of it. She was quite unhappy with the whole thing, yeah. But I mean, I like her too. You're quite right. Like The Getaway is a terrific film. I really like that one. But yeah, here she doesn't really given a lot to do. She's just kind of, I guess, brought in, like I said, as a love interest and a bit of eye candy. Yeah. So on that note, I can't really say anything else about her, really. I mean, she didn't really. I mean, after this, Richard, you might be able to answer this better than me, but did she do a lot after this?
I can't think of much. I mean, she was married to, I'm forgetting his name, the big producer.
Yeah, she was with the guy who was at Paramount Pictures, wasn't she? Sorry?
Yes,
that's right. Yeah. And then she left him for Steve McQueen.
Yeah.
And then around the time, because that was another thing they mentioned, that when she was filming Convoy, she was basically in the middle of kind of breaking up with Steve McQueen.
Right.
And apparently, but Steve McQueen came down to the set a couple times because Sam Peckinpah was being really mean to her, sort of shouting at her a lot and being a little bit unpleasant. So Steve McQueen came down basically just to intimidate him so that he'd stop shouting at her. But apparently they were just in the midst of breaking up at that point.
Right.
And I don't, because after that, because as we get into the 80s, I don't really know that she really was in a lot more films after that.
She seems to have transitioned to television. She's in some TV miniseries and things like that.
Yeah. Oh, and it said she hosted segments for the Encore Love Stories premium cable network.
Well, there you go.
Well, there you go. So she certainly came up in the world in the 90s. But anyway, there you go. Well, bless her. She's in some terrific films, and she's very good in some of them as well. I think you're quite right. And a very striking lady as well.
One of the things about this film is that you sort of slightly wonder, is old Kris Kristofferson's Rubber Duck, Kris Kristofferson's character, is he a Vietnam vet? Because it's very topical at the time. There's lots of these sort of troubled Vietnam vet characters in films around then. But it turns out he's not. But he sort of... he could be, easily, it feels.
Yeah, they don't really say, do they? I don't think they do. I don't recall them mentioning.
They don't say that.
But you're right. It could be, because around that time, it was... wasn't that the year of Deer Hunter, 78?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
pretty much.
Yeah.
But yeah, he definitely has that sort of man at odds with the system type character, isn't he?
Yeah, indeed. And I think, quite right too. Quite right. So, but it's an all right film. I think I quite like Ernest Borgnine in it. I think Ernest Borgnine, he don't get a lot of love, but I think he's a really good actor, actually. A film I quite like that he's in is Emperor of the North. Is that what it's called? The one on the trains with Lee Marvin, actually.
I know what you mean, but I still have not seen that one.
Oh, it's terrific. It is a terrific film, actually.
It's Robert Aldrich, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes. And it's actually got a very young Keith Carradine. And I just watched another Thieves Like Us as well that he's in as well, which is quite a good film. But yeah, Emperor of the North with Ernest Borgnine and Lee Marvin, very, very good sort of action film. And yeah, you definitely, if you get a chance, you should check that out because that's quite a good film. And I think Ernest Borgnine, he was really good at playing heavies and stuff like that. And oddly enough, his famous first film that he got nominated for an Oscar for Marty, where he played this really nice guy. really sort of, but then he went on to play a lot of villains and a lot of sort of, people like that. But I think he's quite terrific in Convoy. And if out of all in all the film, I think he's the one that stood out to me for in terms of his character and his performance, that he's quite good in this. And I think he brings that little bit of menace to the character and stuff. And I quite rate him. So are we saying then, is this a bad film, or are we saying it's an okay film?
I think it's a noble failure.
Okay.
But only because he didn't get to finish it. Right? I think it works. Like a lot of the car chase driven films of this era, it's entertaining.
Yeah,
it's worth watching.
Yeah,
it's enjoyable. It's a film of its time very much as well.
Yeah. It's definitely a time capsule film. There definitely, and I agree with you guys. Although I don't think it's it's just a big dumb film, but it's quite entertaining. I think it has some entertainment value to it, yeah. And yeah, when you compare it to say O.C. and Stiggs, which I think struggles to be entertaining and probably thinks it thinks it's being far cleverer than it is. I think, is that a fair thing to say? Whereas this film, I don't think is trying to be clever at all. Or maybe it was on some level it was trying to be, but who knows? But okay, so this is interesting. I guess you guys are saying you would recommend this film to someone.
Yeah, I would. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, folks, if you're interested in checking out Convoy, I think it's pretty widely available on streaming platforms. I've got the Kino Lorber Blu-ray, which, as I said, is worth kind of picking up because it's got quite a wealth of special features, like contextual stuff that comes on it. There's an audio commentary. And sorry if I sound like I'm selling this, because I'm not getting anything from endorsing this at all. But I'm just telling you it's out there. But the key thing is that there is a 73-minute documentary called "The Passion and Poetry: Sam's Trucker Movie," and it is a documentary about the making of the film, and it has contributions from Kris Kristofferson and who we've sadly lost recently, and lots of people who were involved in the production, including Ali MacGraw as well. And it's worth getting just for that documentary. I think it's quite a good one and gives you a lot of insight into the film. And it's quite good. And I also hear, I don't know about in the States or in North America, but over here, Studio Canal just recently released 4K UHD of Convoy in a like one of those steel books, which I'm not necessarily that big on, but I know some people like to collect them and stuff. So that has just recently come out. So it's easy. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Is Convoy is easy to see if you're interested in checking it out. It's out there, and it's, I think, fairly well-liked film. So people should go and check it out if you're interested in seeing it. And guys, anything else? Any last closing thoughts you'd like to say about Convoy?
Just on availability, I'll say to folks, if you're in an area where your local library supports the Hoopla streaming service, you can watch it for free.
Oh, well, there you go. Free is the best way to see things.
Definitely.
Yeah, so definitely. So Hoopla, is that what it's called? That's the library streaming thing. So you have to be a member of your local library, and then you can have access to it. Yeah. That's brilliant. They don't do that over here, unfortunately, Richard.
They don't do it everywhere here too, but both Hoopla and Canopy in North America can be, your library might support them, and the Winnipeg Public Library does both. So,
brilliant! Oh, you're lucky. We don't get any of that stuff over here at all.
Have audiobooks for free on your library app, and but not films, as far as I know.
Okay. well, maybe one day that will change. Although the way things are going with our conservative government in disguise that we have at the minute, I'm not sure we're going to see any improvements in the library services anytime soon. So, on that cheery note, guys, Richard, thank you very much for joining us again. It was great to have you back, and hopefully we can get you back. We talked about one or two other ideas for things that I think you might be well suited to join in on the conversation. So I'll certainly reach out to you in the future, hopefully soon, to talk about that. And is there anything you wanted to plug or anything that you were wanted to mention before we let you go today?
I don't do anything. I come when people ask me, but I don't. I'm just like an amateur reviewer and stuff like that. But nothing.
Well, people should look out for you on Facebook because you're a good follow on Facebook. You do lots of good film reviews and things like that. But Richard, also, we could mention that you and I both just recently guested on David Blakesley's Criterion Reflections, talking about Godzilla vs. Megalon. And that was just released just last week, just during the week. So if people want to go and hear some captivating discussion around one of the late period Showa era Godzilla films, Richard and I are both together on that episode there, and it's worth checking. There you go. We've got something to plug. And Jonathan, anything exciting happen for you in the next little while?
No, nothing.
No? Fantastic. Well, I'm glad I asked. Well, no, me neither. But anyway, but what I can say is that we'll be back. We had to change a few plans around, but we've got some interesting guests lined up to talk about some really interesting subjects over the next couple of episodes. So, folks, now would be a really great time for you to hit that subscribe button or hit that follow button, depending where you find us. And then you'll hear all about our next episode as soon as it drops. And in the meantime, thank you for joining us and having a listen in. And Richard, thank you again for rejoining us today. And we hope to catch up with you again soon. And Jonathan, always a pleasure to chat films with you as well.
Absolutely. Love it.
So, folks, take care of yourselves. Go out and search out Convoy and OC and Stiggs if you want to dig deep into those. And we will catch up with you very soon.
Brilliant. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Film Swap podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider giving the show a rating or leaving a review. This helps other listeners find the show.
Oh, that's the things these nerdy middle-aged men get up to.